In February 2019, West Point cadet Peter Zhu died in a ski accident. He was a registered organ donor, and his body was kept on life support in preparation for removal of organs for donation and transplantation. As an organ donor, his tragic death would provide a greater quality of life for the strangers that received his organs, as well as their families and loved ones. However, the legacy of his life doesn't end there. As a consequence of China's one-child policy, Peter was the only male child able to continue the Zhu family lineage. His parents sought and received New York Supreme Court approval to retrieve and store his sperm until a future court date could decide if the sperm could be used. In the hearing, his parents testified that Peter had dreamed of having several children and felt the responsibility to carry on his cultural and family legacy. In May of 2019, his parents received approval to attempt conception with a surrogate mother with the collected sperm. In this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science, we are going to ask the question, should the dead reproduce? In this video, we are going to look at the science and technology involved with in vitro fertilization and storage of gametes, eggs, and sperm, and potentially fertilized embryos, as well as some of the advances that have occurred with reproductive technology, as well as some of the concerns associated with it. The ability to obtain viable sperm from a deceased individual was first reported in 1980 within the journal Fertility and Sterility. Now, the technology and procedures have continued to improve, and a report published in 2023 indicated that it is possible to retrieve viable sperm up to 106 hours, more than 4 days after death. The American Society for Reproductive Medicine Ethics Committee provides guidance on posthumous meaning after death, egg or sperm retrieval for reproductive purposes when there is a written documentation of the deceased person's wishes. In the absence of written consent, the Ethics Committee provides a process to consider a request from the surviving spouse or partner. Collection of the egg or sperm is limited to a very short window after death, but they can be frozen for an extended period of time in a process called cryostorage or cryopreservation. This ethics committee emphasizes that the collection of egg or sperm does not commit to the use of the egg and sperm for later reproduction. Embryos created by in vitro fertilization prior to death are treated similarly. These guidelines do not provide an ethical claim to the reproductive material to the deceased parents who may be seeking a potential grandchild. A study in 2018 looked at a variety of countries and found that within these countries, they often lack laws covering both the posthumous egg and sperm retrieval as well as the process of posthumous reproduction. When guidelines are present, they are generally not legally binding and may not be enforced. Because of the short amount of time the gametes, the egg and sperm, are viable after death, this may result in judges leaning towards approving retrieval and postponing consideration of their use in posthumous reproduction to a later point. Though not common at this point, the number of requests and procedures for posthumous sperm retrieval continue to increase. The process of in vitro fertilization involves the combining of egg and sperm outside of the body as an effort to treat various forms of infertility. Now, the process of in vitro fertilization is relatively new. The first non-human mammal conceived through in vitro fertilization occurred in 1959, and the world's first baby conceived by in vitro fertilization was born in 1978, so roughly 45 years ago. Within the process of in vitro fertilization, the eggs are collected from the ovary. They're combined with sperm within an environment outside of the body. In vitro basically means in glass, and so they're going to be occurring in a clinical laboratory setting, allowing the egg and the sperm to come together, resulting in fertilized eggs, which will develop into embryos. Once these embryos have developed for a short period of time, they can then be implanted into the uterus of the biological mother or a surrogate mother who are going to house these embryos as they go through embryonic fetal development up until the time of childbirth. If these embryos are not used for implantation right away, they can be stored in the process of cryoprotection or cryopreservation. In the process of cryopreservation, we use these chambers, which are basically filled with liquid nitrogen. Now, liquid nitrogen is going to be cold to the point of about negative 196 degrees Celsius. For those that are metrically challenged, this is about negative 321 degrees Fahrenheit. So basically, you can take your samples. You can take the eggs, you can take the sperm, or you can take fertilized embryos, store them within little tubes here, which will then be submerged in the liquid nitrogen and frozen for periods of time up to and beyond 10 years. Now, scientists have been able to show that there's about a 95% survivability of these frozen embryos through the thawing process. And so it is a very reliable method for preserving these biological tissues. Now, there are various scenarios involved with posthumous reproduction. And a classic example of this is sustaining a deceased mother who is pregnant at the time for a period of time to allow for the fetus to develop. Now, generally, when a pregnant mother dies, the physician's duty to the patient ends, i.e. the mother is dead. And at that point, there's a question about whether the physician's obligation then goes towards treating and sustaining the fetus. Now, under ideal circumstances, the baby would be delivered right away. However, for a very premature fetus, early on in a pregnancy, the fetus may not have developed to a stage where it is viable, and the mother may be kept on what is colloquially termed as life support. Now, keep in mind, the mother is deceased at this point, the mother is dead, and so life support is really kind of scientifically called somatic care or continuing somatic care. And so this is basically providing somatic support to preserve the body's biological functions for a limited period of time under normal circumstances to allow for organ donation, or in this case, for continuation of the pregnancy to allow for the fetus to develop. Now, relatively rare, up until about 2017, there were 40 published reports of brain-dead women kept on this continued somatic care until the embryo, or the fetus at that point, had developed to a point where it was capable of surviving. Now, this generates additional ethical questions that we're not going to focus in on in today's talk. But basically, is it morally permissible or morally obligatory to try to save the fetus by keeping the brain-dead deceased mother on continuing somatic care? It's not life support truly because the mother is dead, for an extended period of time. Another example of posthumous reproduction is using in vitro fertilized embryos that were created before the death of one of the parties. Now, there are a variety of guidelines in present for what occurs to in vitro fertilized embryos that are in storage, basically in that cryoprotection. If both of the parties, both parents, are dead, potentially the embryo could be used or donated to another couple. If the mother is alive, the embryo can be implanted into her uterus to allow for development of the fetus to the point of birth. And if the father is alive, he could have the embryo implanted within a new partner or into a surrogate mother. Now, again, ethical controversies associated with this is that most institutions have a relatively short period of time, often 10 years, in which the embryos can be stored prior to use. Now, returning to a scenario closer to what we're talking about with Peter Zhu and his retrieved sperm, at the University of Sydney, in a paper published in 2022, scientists demonstrated that sperm frozen for 50 years could be used to impregnate sheep with the same effectiveness of sperm frozen for a year. Now, there are examples in humans where babies have been born using sperm that have been stored for 27 years. Now, the technology for storing the sperm, basically in that liquid nitrogen in a frozen state, this technology allows for viable samples well beyond the current guidelines for storage and use of sperm for reproduction. Now, the impact of this technology is limited for now, since the freezing of sperm first began in the 1950s, but it could present interesting questions going into the future. Science and technology provide the opportunity for something to occur, but we still have to consider the ethics as to whether or not it is something that should be occurring. Now, there are religious arguments against in vitro fertilization, against the posthumous retrieval and use of the sperm for reproductive purposes, related to the sanctity of the deceased body. And so this is different than organ donation, which restores function to an existing person. We're talking about using these tissues, biological tissues, egg and sperm, collected after the individual is deceased in the process of in vitro fertilization to create a new organism. Within the Catholic argument, the Donum Vitae states, a child has a right to be conceived, carried in the womb, and brought into the world and brought up by his parents. It goes further to say to intentionally create a child outside of this situation represents an objective failure to meet the obligations of parental love, of conjugal fidelity, and of responsible parenthood. So the religious argument basically says that this process of posthumous reproduction violates the dignity of the deceased parent and violates the dignity of what would be this child born potentially without a father. And so religious arguments against it. Other arguments could be things like a psychological argument, saying, is this posthumous reproduction in the best interest of the resulting child? This is a child potentially growing up without having two parents available to them. So now we reach the ethical dilemma in science for this week. Should the dead reproduce? Should there be explicit and enforceable laws on the posthumous retrieval of gametes, gametes being the eggs and the sperm, and posthumous reproduction, or should the guidelines remain flexible to address unique situations? In deciding to approve or deny a request for posthumous gamete retrieval and or reproduction, does it matter if the deceased and their partner are married, if they're engaged, or committed to creating a family in some way? And then finally, should the request be considered when in the absence of a partner, the next of kin is the deceased person's parents? Thank you for listening to this week's Ethical Dilemma in Science. As always, please see the description below for additional information and references. Thank you, and have a great week.